I didn't think much of it at first. A nightmare, nothing more. We all have those random horrors that catch us off guard, sending us spiraling awake, heart pounding, reaching for any piece of comfort. But this was different. The dream began as an echo of someplace I couldn't remember, a darkened corridor stretching endlessly before me, its walls draped in peeling wallpaper and shadow. The air felt thick, a dampness clinging to my skin, and despite every instinct urging me to turn back, I kept moving forward. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hall. Cloaked in shadow, it was nothing more than a silhouette, but somehow I knew it was looking straight at me. Though it didn't speak, I felt the weight of its silence, pressing into my mind, its presence more suffocating than the darkness around me. It didn't move, didn't advance. It just stood, as if waiting for me to do something to acknowledge it. I tried to speak, to ask it who or what it was, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, feeling its stare crawl over my skin like ice. When I woke up, my heart was hammering so hard it hurt. I told myself it was just a nightmare, that the shadowy figure was just a figment of my imagination. Yet, the feeling stayed with me, lingering like the smell of smoke in an empty room. And as I lay there, staring into the pitch-black void of my bedroom, I felt its gaze still, as if it had followed me, slipping out of the dream and into my waking world. The second night, I was almost too afraid to fall asleep. I lay there in bed, heart racing, as if just anticipating the dream would somehow draw it closer. But exhaustion crept over me, dragging me down into the dark, and before I knew it, I was back. Same hallway, same damp, sickly smell. And there it was again, standing farther down the corridor, barely more than a silhouette in the shadows. But this time, something felt different. It was closer. I froze, feeling its invisible eyes lock onto me. The silence weighed heavier than before, thick with an unnatural tension, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I wanted to scream at it, to yell at my own mind to stop this madness, but fear paralyzed me. I just stood there, helpless, under that unspoken pressure, feeling something in me splintering. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, yet I could feel it willing me to look deeper, to come closer. It wanted me to step into the dark with it. When I jolted awake, my room was cold, an icy dampness that didn't belong. I threw on the lights, desperate to shake off the lingering terror, but the feeling clung to me like frost. I could barely bring myself to glance at the shadows in the corners of the room, half expecting it to be there, waiting for me. I didn't sleep again that night, afraid of what I'd find if I closed my eyes, afraid that, in the dream, it would come even closer. I drifted through that day like a ghost, barely present. People's faces blurred past me, their voices muffled and distant. My head felt heavy, like my skull was stuffed with fog, and every step felt as if I were wading through sand. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the lingering terror, that chilling sense of being followed, even in the light of day. I kept telling myself it was just a dream, a trick of the mind, some stress-induced nightmare I'd shake off soon enough. But the figure was with me, its presence clinging to my thoughts. I saw it in every darkened reflection, felt it hovering just out of view whenever I turned around. Its silence was everywhere, filling every room I stepped into with a cold, unnatural stillness. At lunch, I caught my reflection in a diner's glass window, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw it standing just behind me, a shadow blotting out the sunlight. When I spun around, there was no one there, just the usual bustle of people. But the feeling, that quiet, creeping dread, never left. In the afternoon, I went to the pharmacy, hoping maybe some sleeping pills or sedatives would keep the dreams at bay. I waited in line, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above, and fought the urge to close my eyes. The pharmacist asked how he could help, but when I opened my mouth, I stammered, unsure how to even begin. Just something to help me sleep, I managed. He eyed me warily, the concern written in his expression, but handed me a small box without asking questions. I paid and left, gripping the pills tightly as if they could somehow protect me from the night. When the sun began to sink, I went back to my apartment and closed all the blinds, hoping to shut out the shadows. The lights were all on, chasing away any corner that might hold a trace of darkness. Yet still, I felt it lingering just beyond my sight, as if waiting for the moment I'd let my guard down. As evening bled into night, I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the pill bottle, knowing I couldn't put off sleep forever. I was trapped, helpless in my own mind, waiting for the nightmare to pull me under again. And though I hadn't yet closed my eyes, I could almost feel it already. The figure waiting for me in the shadows, closer than ever before. I held off as long as I could. The pills sat beside me, a last-ditch defense I was almost afraid to use. The clock ticked past midnight, its hands dragging forward, each minute drawing me closer to the inevitable. Every creak of my apartment, every murmur of the wind outside, made me flinch, thinking maybe this time the figure would break into reality and shatter the fragile barrier between my waking life and the nightmare. But I couldn't fight it forever. Finally, defeated, I swallowed 2 of the pills and lay back, watching the ceiling blur above me. My eyes grew heavy, the light around me bending and dimming, as if sinking into a deep, dark pool. And then I was back. The hallway loomed around me, darker than before, as if something had drawn the shadows closer, narrowing the space. The air was thick and stifling, pressing against my skin with a cold dampness. My heart hammered against my ribs, already knowing what I'd see at the end of the corridor. The figure waited, closer now, its edges sharper and more defined. It didn't have a face, just a dark void, smooth and featureless, as if my mind couldn't even bear to imagine what lay beneath. But the emptiness stared, an unholy concentration of attention that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to break the silence that bound me, but my throat was locked tight. All I could do was watch as it moved, just a fraction, 1 foot, sliding forward. Every step felt like a nail driven into my spine, inch by inch pulling it closer, binding it to me. As it advanced, the darkness around it seemed to pulse, creeping toward me as though it were alive, stretching out long, bony shadows that slithered over the walls. The figure paused, just close enough for me to feel its presence fill every inch of the air, pressing in like a vice around my heart. The silence was unbearable, a suffocating void, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. And then it lifted its hand, no more than a faint outline in the dark, but unmistakably directed at me. I tried to force myself awake, to tear free of its grasp, but I was trapped, held down by some invisible weight. My own heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything, echoing through the hall like a death knell. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, I woke with a gasp, bolting upright, the cold sweat already chilling my skin. My room was filled with shadows, the night pressing against the windows, and I could still feel its gaze, lingering, watching. I sat there, shivering, unable to shake the sense that it had come closer, closer than it ever had before. I was beginning to lose track of what was real. All day, my mind felt fogged, my senses dulled by the relentless lack of sleep. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was ghastly. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and my skin had taken on a sickly, pale sheen. I barely recognized myself. It was as if the figure's darkness had seeped into my skin, staining me from the inside. I tried to distract myself, to lose myself in the mundane details of the day, but no matter what I did, the figure haunted the edges of my vision. I'd glance at the corner of my bedroom and catch a glimpse of something tall and dark. Just a shadow, I'd tell myself, but the pit in my stomach knew better. It felt as if it were creeping into my reality, piece by piece, slipping through the cracks of my mind. The worst was when I looked into mirrors. My reflection felt wrong, somehow like it wasn't moving in sync with me. Once, while washing my hands, I caught a glimpse of the figure's shadowy form standing just behind my shoulder. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the bathroom was empty. I stared at the empty space, breath held, half expecting it to appear again. But there was nothing, just my hollow, terrified reflection staring back at me. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on sanity. Even as the day wore on, I felt the weight of sleep pulling at me, tempting me to let go and fall back into that shadowed corridor, back to the faceless horror waiting within it. By evening, I was a wreck. The isolation of it, the sheer terror of something I couldn't escape, was eating me alive. I tried calling a friend, but as I fumbled for words, I realized there was no way to explain. How do you tell someone you're being haunted by a dream? How do you make them believe that it isn't just some figment of your imagination, that it's real, that it's coming closer each time you close your eyes? I felt trapped, cornered by something I couldn't see, and it dawned on me that I needed help. Real, serious help. I couldn't face this alone anymore. That night, with a last look at my hollow reflection in the mirror, I made the decision. Tomorrow, I'd check myself into the psychiatric ward, just to be safe. By the time I reached the psychiatric hospital the next morning, I was barely hanging on. The figure's presence seemed to have followed me, lingering just outside my field of vision, a looming darkness I couldn't shake. I felt as if it were watching me, waiting for me to slip back into the world of dreams so it could draw closer once again. The receptionist looked me over with a hint of pity as I stammered through my words, trying to explain my situation. I'm having nightmares, but it's more than that. It's something following me. I could tell by the slight narrowing of her eyes that she was used to hearing all manner of things, but still, her gaze softened, and she nodded as if she understood. A doctor named Dr. Reeves admitted me. He was calm, his voice gentle, and asked me questions as we walked down the quiet, sterile corridors of the ward. I stumbled over my words, telling him about the dreams, the figure, and how it was getting closer, slipping into my waking world. Dr. Reeves just nodded, making notes on a clipboard, his face an unreadable mask. They set me up in a small room at the end of a dim corridor. The walls were bare, the light above a sickly fluorescent glow that flickered from time to time, sending shadows crawling over the walls. My bed was small, with a thin, rough blanket, and the single window was tightly bolted shut. I lay there for hours, too exhausted to move but too terrified to sleep. Night began to fall, and the shadows grew thicker, pressing in around me. I heard the low hum of distant conversations from the staff at the nurses' station down the hall, but their voices felt far away, like echoes in a vast, empty space. I felt alone, so profoundly alone, and the darkness seemed to pulse with that familiar, dreadful weight. It was then that I saw it, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, in the mirror mounted on the far wall. I froze, my heart pounding as I looked closer. There, in the dim reflection, a shadow shifted, taller and darker than anything else in the room. The figure was here, but it was no longer a dream. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the mirror. There it was, standing just behind me, the faceless figure shrouded in shadow, its presence as real as the cold walls around me. My breath hitched, and I fought the urge to scream, afraid to draw it any closer. The room was silent, yet its presence filled the air with a thick, dreadful tension. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow every sound. I wanted to move, to bolt out of that room and into the fluorescent-lit hallway, but fear anchored me to the spot. I could feel its gaze boring into me, a silent promise that it wouldn't be satisfied until I gave it my full attention. Slowly, I forced myself to turn around, to face it, to see if it was truly there, or just some trick of my exhausted mind. But when I looked, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the empty walls and the hum of the overhead light. I shuddered, but as my eyes flitted back to the mirror, it was there again, closer. It was as if the mirror were its doorway, a thin barrier it could press against, biding its time until it found a way through. I felt trapped, caught in a loop between what was real and what my mind could barely comprehend. I tore my gaze away, forcing myself to breathe, whispering reassurances that this was all just another symptom of my sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew better. As night pressed on, every reflection in the room seemed to hold a hint of that figure. Fleeting glimpses in the window, shifting shadows on the blank, white walls. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. By morning, I was a wreck, my mind frayed to the edges, terror clawing its way into every thought. I'd come here to escape, to break free of its grip on me. But now, even in the cold, clinical walls of the hospital, the figure was with me, slipping through every reflection, watching, waiting. And each time it seemed just a bit closer. The nurses noticed the strain on my face, the way my hands trembled whenever they brought me my meals. They whispered among themselves, casting me those wary, sympathetic looks reserved for people they thought were beyond saving. But I was barely aware of them. My mind was consumed by a single gnawing thought. I wasn't alone here. It was here, in this place, following me, getting closer with each hour. I tried to tell Dr. Reeves during our morning session. He watched me with a clinical calm as I stammered through my words, explaining how the figure was slipping from my nightmares into the real world. But the more I tried to convey the horror of it, the more his face settled into an expression I recognized too well, a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. "You've been under considerable stress, Max," he said softly, writing on his clipboard. "Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations. I think it's your mind trying to process your fear. Sometimes the brain creates these visions to confront what we're most afraid of." I wanted to scream at him, to shake him until he understood that this wasn't just a hallucination. It wasn't a product of stress or some psychological illusion. But the words caught in my throat. How could I make him believe me when I could hardly believe it myself? The rest of the day passed in a blur, the sterile walls pressing in on me, the lights flickering overhead. Every surface seemed to reflect back a hint of that shadow, the faintest suggestion of movement just beyond the edge of my vision. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, searching every corner for a hint of its presence, terrified of what I might see if I looked too long. The staff began to avoid my room, leaving my meals outside the door and checking on me only when necessary. They must have thought I was becoming unhinged, just another patient lost to his own delusions. But in the silence of the late afternoon, when the light outside began to fade, I caught a glimpse of it again. This time, it was in the reflection of the metal bed frame, a faint, dark outline lurking at the foot of my bed. And this time I heard it, a whisper, so soft it was almost a breath, filling the room with a chilling sense of purpose. Soon, the word hung in the air, sinking into my bones, and I felt something inside me break. It wasn't just waiting anymore. It was coming for me, crossing from nightmare into reality. That whisper haunted me long after it faded, replaying in my mind like a sinister lullaby. Soon, it echoed with each heartbeat, a reminder that whatever this thing was, it was growing bolder, closing in with every second. I spent the day pacing the small confines of my room, the walls pressing in as if they, too, were conspiring to trap me with this thing. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, not with that voice haunting me. But exhaustion clawed at my senses, dragging me down, and despite everything, my body betrayed me. It didn't take long before I slipped into a restless doze, and that's when the nightmare reclaimed me. This time, the setting was different. I was no longer in the endless hallway. Instead, I stood in what looked disturbingly like the hospital itself. The corridors stretched out before me, unnervingly quiet, the fluorescent lights above buzzing and flickering. The silence was suffocating, and I knew, even before I turned around, that it was there. The figure waited, motionless, at the end of the corridor. Its faceless head was tilted as if it were studying me, the black void where a face should have been seeming to draw in the dim light around it. Its arms hung at its sides, but there was something almost expectant in its stance, like it was waiting for me to take a step closer, to acknowledge it, to let it in. And then, in the eerie silence, it moved. A single step. The sound echoed down the empty corridor, each footfall a leaden thud in the oppressive quiet. Another step, then another, its slow advance bringing it closer, closer than it had ever been before. I wanted to run, to scream, to break free from this waking nightmare, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed under the weight of its silent approach. I managed to tear my gaze from it just long enough to look at my own reflection in a window lining the hall. My face looked distorted, pale and hollow-eyed, but behind me, I could see the figure, closing the distance, inch by agonizing inch. I tried to scream, to do something, but the sound died in my throat, leaving only a choked, desperate gasp. Just as it reached out toward me, a hand stretching from the void, I jolted awake, back in my room. I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. But the worst part? When I looked around the room, the dim light of early evening casting shadows across the walls, I could still feel it. I could feel it there, lingering in the darkness, as if it had finally managed to slip through the fragile barrier between dream and waking life. And I knew, without a doubt, that this time it was here to stay. The following morning, I couldn't bring myself to leave my room. My legs felt like lead, and even the thought of stepping into the hallway filled me with a sense of dread so visceral it seemed to root me in place. I knew what I'd seen the night before wasn't a simple dream. The figure had crossed over. It had found me here, in this hospital, lurking within the very walls I'd come to for refuge. Dr. Reeves visited, his expression softer, tinged with concern, but I could barely look at him. I felt like I was unraveling, caught in a nightmare from which I could never fully wake. When he asked if I wanted to try another medication, I only nodded, the words stuck in my throat, tangled with fear. After he left, the silence of the room pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I could feel the weight of something in the air, a presence lurking just out of sight, watching me from some hidden corner. My eyes darted to the mirror, to the reflective sheen of the metal bed frame, to any surface that could catch a glimpse of its shadow. I was terrified of what I might see, but even more terrified of looking away. When night fell, the nurses dimmed the lights in the corridor, leaving long, dark shadows stretching across the floor. I huddled on the bed, eyes fixed on the mirror. Every time my eyelids drooped, every time exhaustion tugged at me, I jolted myself awake, unwilling to let my guard down for even a second. But exhaustion doesn't ask permission, and somewhere in the early hours, I drifted off despite myself. The nightmare swallowed me immediately, as if it had been waiting, ready to consume me the moment I let go. I found myself back in the hospital corridors, but this time, the lights were dead, plunging everything into a cold, inky darkness. A silence hung in the air, so thick it felt alive, pressing against my ears like cotton. And then, in the oppressive blackness, I heard it. The soft, measured sound of footsteps, growing louder, closer. Each step was a heavy, deliberate thud, reverberating down the empty hallways, filling the silence with a dreadful rhythm. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My limbs felt leaden, as though I were bound in place by some invisible force. Panic clawed at my throat as the footsteps approached, unhurried, confident. And then I saw it. A shadow within the shadows, darker than the pitch-black corridor itself. It glided toward me, each step slow and deliberate, until it stood only a breath away. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth, and I could feel its gaze, hollow and endless, pouring over me. I forced myself to look up, and there, for the first time, I saw the faintest outline of a face within that darkness. A mouth, twisted into a cruel, silent smile. A paralyzing terror washed over me, but before I could scream, before I could even breathe, I woke up, back in my room. Yet something was wrong. The mirror on the far wall was covered in condensation, as though someone had exhaled against the glass, leaving behind one chilling word. Soon, the figure was no longer content to wait in dreams. It was coming for me, step by step, crossing the boundaries of reality. And I knew, as I sat there, that it wouldn't stop until it had me. The next morning, I found myself staring at that single word on the mirror, my heart pounding, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch it. Soon, the condensation was cold against my fingers, chilling me to the core. It was a mark, a promise left behind by something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. But here it was, a chilling reminder that this thing was close, closer than ever before. Desperation overtook me. I ran down the hall to find Dr. Reeves. nearly tripping over myself as I reached his office. I pounded on the door, my voice breaking as I called his name, words tumbling out in a frantic rush the moment he opened the door. "Please, you have to help me," I stammered, clutching his arm, my voice barely a whisper. "It's here. It's not just in my head. It left something in my room." He glanced at me, his face a mask of professional calm, but I could see the concern in his eyes, the way they flickered with something like pity. He guided me to a chair and sat across from me, his voice gentle. "Max, these hallucinations feel real, but I assure you, they're part of your mind's response to extreme sleep deprivation. Your brain is trying to process the fear by creating something tangible." "No!" I interrupted, my voice rising, my hands clenching into fists. "It's real. I'm not hallucinating. I'm not." But he didn't flinch, only looked at me with that same pitying gaze, as if I were just another patient spiraling out of control. He nodded sympathetically, saying he'd adjust my medication, that perhaps a sedative would help me rest, help me separate reality from these visions. But his words felt hollow, meaningless against the unrelenting dread coiling within me. I was alone in this. No one believed me, not Dr. Reeves, not the nurses, no one. They thought I was just another lost mind, unraveling under the weight of my own fears. I returned to my room, feeling the cold isolation of it, the stifling silence pressing down on me. The word had faded from the mirror, as if mocking my desperation, vanishing as soon as I'd tried to prove its existence. But I knew that it was only hiding, biding its time, waiting for the night to fall. The hours ticked by, dragging me closer to darkness, each second a leaden weight in my chest. I tried to stay awake, pacing, muttering to myself, anything to keep the terror at bay. But the weight of exhaustion was a siren's call, lulling me into a haze, and despite my best efforts, I felt my eyelids grow heavy, my body surrendering. And just as sleep claimed me, I heard it again, a soft, breathy whisper that made my skin crawl, filling the empty room with its promise. Soon, I was caught, helpless, and this time, I knew that no amount of medication, no doctors, no locked doors could keep it away. It was coming, slipping through the shadows, and I was trapped, completely alone with whatever horror waited in the dark. I don't know when I finally drifted into sleep that night, but it was as if the darkness had been waiting, pulling me under the moment I let my guard down. I found myself standing once again in the endless hallway, the walls of the hospital stretching out in a bleak, unnatural silence. The familiar, chilling dread coiled around me, tighter than ever. I forced myself to move, each step a fight against the suffocating fear that threatened to paralyze me. Every footfall echoed, swallowed by the oppressive quiet, and I realized with a bone-deep certainty that this wasn't just a dream anymore. It was something else, a place where the lines between nightmare and reality blurred, a place it had drawn me to. And then I saw it. The figure stood only a few yards away, closer than it had ever been before. Its form was sharper now, more defined, as if the shadows had thickened around it, solidifying. I could almost make out the shape of its limbs, the faint suggestion of a face hidden within that abyssal darkness. But what made my blood run cold was the way it stood, watching me with a patience that felt ancient, endless, like it had all the time in the world to close the distance between us. "Who are you?" I forced myself to ask, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. My throat was tight, my heart pounding so violently it hurt. The figure didn't respond, but something in the air shifted, an unspoken acknowledgement, as if it had finally heard me. And then, slowly, it began to move forward. One step, another. Its approach was agonizingly slow, as if it relished every inch it claimed, every heartbeat of fear it drew from me. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey, as if the darkness had chained me to the spot. All I could do was watch, frozen, as it came closer, its silent, endless gaze piercing into me. And then, just as it reached within arm's length, it lifted a hand, a pale, skeletal outline reaching toward me. A chill washed over me, colder than anything I'd ever felt, as if death itself were reaching out to pull me into the void. I wanted to scream, to tear myself free, but no sound escaped. Its hand drifted closer, fingers splayed, trembling with a silent anticipation. Just as its touch grazed my skin, I felt an intense jolt, a snap in my mind, like something had broken free. I woke with a scream, my body drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing so hard I thought it might burst. But the horror didn't end there. The room was dark, the shadows pooling in every corner, pressing against the walls, and there, just beyond the bed, I saw it. A faint, shadowy outline lingering at the edge of the room. I blinked, my breath caught in my throat, but it didn't fade. It stayed there, watching, its form twisted and unnatural in the dim light. And then, in a whisper that barely stirred the air, I heard it, as clear as my own heartbeat. I'm here. This time it wasn't a promise. It was a statement, a chilling fact. It had crossed over, and now it was part of my waking life, slipping between nightmares and reality. And I knew that as long as I stayed in this hospital, there would be no escape. The figure's words echoed in my mind, a quiet certainty that froze me in place. I'm here. The realization clawed its way into my thoughts. I was no longer safe in the waking world. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were its territory, creeping into every darkened corner, every space I once thought safe. I spent the entire day on edge, jumping at the slightest sound, eyes darting to every shadow that pooled around the room. I couldn't eat, could barely breathe, and the nurses who came in looked at me with pity. But I didn't care about their silent judgments. I was too afraid to look away, convinced that if I even blinked, the figure would slip closer. I tried to tell Dr. Reeves again, but he only sighed, a frown creasing his forehead as he regarded me with that same, practiced patience. Max, these hallucinations are worsening. I'd like to increase your dosage and try some deeper relaxation techniques to help ease your anxiety. I promise. We'll find a way to help you feel safe. I almost laughed. A bitter, humorless sound. Safe? There was no safety left. The figure had crossed over, and it was here, lingering in every reflection, every flicker of dim light in the room. I was trapped with it, forced to endure its silent, patient watch. As evening descended, the shadows stretched longer, pulling away from the corners and creeping across the walls, shifting in shapes that looked sickeningly familiar. The mirror on the far wall grew darker, as if absorbing the very light in the room, becoming a window into something otherworldly. And then I saw it, the faint, shadowed outline hovering just behind me in the reflection, waiting. I forced myself to look away, clenching my fists, my knuckles white. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, an unyielding pressure, like invisible eyes scraping over my skin. The room grew colder, and I could feel its presence pressing in, tightening around me, a silent threat that promised it was done waiting. Then came the whisper. Why resist? The voice slithered through the air, thin as smoke, but it sank into my mind, filling my thoughts with a sickening dread. I forced myself to look at the mirror again, and there it was, closer than ever, standing just behind me. Its form almost solid now, a dark, twisted shape with barely visible eyes gleaming within its void-like face. In a panicked frenzy, I grabbed the edge of the mirror, ready to hurl it to the floor, to shatter it and be rid of this haunting reflection. But as my fingers curled around the cold, unforgiving glass, I felt a chill radiate through my hands, a searing coldness that burned like frostbite. I dropped it with a gasp, stumbling backward, and the figure tilted its head, watching with an eerie calm, as if amused by my helplessness. I backed into the corner, pressing myself against the wall, my chest heaving, heart pounding. I tried to close my eyes, but I felt its presence like a hand tightening around my throat, choking the breath from me. And then, in that whispering voice, I heard it again, closer, filling the room with an unholy, almost gentle finality. You're already mine. The words sank into me, colder than death, a truth I couldn't deny. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just haunting me. It was claiming me, and I knew, with a dread that turned my blood to ice, that it was only a matter of time before it pulled me into its world. Forever. That night, something in me snapped. The fear, the exhaustion, the constant, suffocating dread. It all boiled over. If this figure wanted me, if it was going to drag me into some place beyond reason, I would face it. I would look it in the eyes, as hollow and empty as they were, and demand answers. So, when the darkness finally closed in and the figure reappeared, hovering just beyond the foot of my bed, I didn't look away. I sat up, gripping the thin, rough blanket in my fists, meeting its gaze with every ounce of defiance I could muster. "Why?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What are you? Why are you haunting me?" The figure tilted its head, an almost curious gesture. And in that silence, I felt its cold, chilling intent. The sense that I was being measured weighed like it was deciding just how much it would allow me to understand. I held its gaze, unblinking, my heart racing as I fought to keep the terror from overtaking me. Then, without a sound, it took a step forward. The air in the room thickened, a darkness so profound that it seemed to absorb everything around it, warping the room's very walls. The figure reached out, and I could see its hand, long, slender fingers, bones barely covered in a translucent, ashen skin. I wanted to recoil, to back away, but I forced myself to stay still, to watch as that hand extended toward me. And then it touched me. The coldness was indescribable. It sank into my skin, through muscle, down to my bones, spreading a numbing chill that seemed to freeze every thought, every memory, every fragment of myself. The walls around me blurred, fading into a void, and suddenly, I was no longer in my hospital room. I was standing in that dark corridor again, the hallway that had haunted my dreams from the beginning. But this time it was different, more solid, more real. I could feel the damp chill of the walls, smell the sickly, stale air. The figure stood beside me, close enough that I could sense its silent breathing, a slow, rhythmic pulse of icy presence. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it turned and gestured down the hall, as if inviting me forward, guiding me deeper into the shadows. I didn't want to follow, but something in me, a piece of myself that I couldn't control, compelled my legs to move. Step by step, I was drawn forward, into the endless dark, the figure's presence looming beside me, guiding me like a shepherd leading a lamb to slaughter. As we walked, whispers filled the air, faint and distant, voices of countless others, murmuring, pleading, echoing through the void. I felt their terror, their despair, as if each soul trapped within these walls was reaching out, trying to warn me, to pull me back. But I was past the point of turning back. The figure's grip on me was absolute, pulling me into a darkness so profound it felt like the end of all things. And just as the void seemed to swallow me whole, I felt it. The figure's touch again, a final, claiming grip on my shoulder, freezing me in place. Its voice whispered in my ear, soft, inescapable, "Welcome home." And with that, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the hospital room, lying on the cold, stiff mattress, the dim light overhead casting a sickly glow. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I'd run miles. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare, if I'd somehow escaped that dark, endless corridor. But the feeling in the room, the thick, oppressive stillness, told me otherwise. I could still feel it, the figure's presence, lingering like a shadow pressed into the walls. I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the bed, scanning the room for any sign of it. But it wasn't in the mirror or hovering at the foot of the bed. The figure had vanished, as if retreating to some unseen corner of my mind. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, to convince myself it was just another episode, another dream that had crossed over. But when the nurse entered the room, her face drained of color, I knew it was more than that. Her wide, anxious eyes darted around the room, her voice barely more than a whisper as she asked, "Max, did you see anyone in here?" I shook my head, unable to form words. She didn't press me, just backed away slowly, as if she, too, could feel that cold, dreadful presence. The following days in the ward became a twisted blur. The figure no longer showed itself directly, but I felt it everywhere. In the mirrors, in the sterile reflections off the metal fixtures, in the shadowed corners of the hallways. And when I closed my eyes, even for a second, I could feel it waiting, just beyond the thin veil of my mind, ready to pull me back into that darkness. Dr. Reeves continued to meet with me, his face increasingly concerned as I shared less and less about what I was experiencing. I knew that no words could capture the terror I was feeling. He'd only think I was spiraling further, sinking into some imagined world of my own making. So, I stayed quiet, retreating deeper into myself, trying to find some way to keep the figure at bay. But each night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the ward settled into its cold, eerie silence, the shadows would begin to move. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, a shape blending into the darkness. The figure was still there, still with me, watching, waiting. And one night, when I could no longer hold back the terror, I whispered into the silence, "What do you want?" There was no response, but the air felt colder, the shadows darker, like a silent acknowledgement. I was trapped, bound to this place by fear and the knowledge that even if I left, the figure would follow, slipping back into my dreams, haunting every darkened room, every reflective surface. I was its captive, its quiet possession, locked within the sterile walls of the hospital ward. And as the days wore on, the staff's whispers grew, casting glances my way, murmuring about the chill in my room, about lights flickering when they entered. They knew something was wrong, but they could never understand what I did. The figure had claimed me, and it would never let me go. I was alone, surrounded by people who couldn't see it, who couldn't feel the cold dread that lingered in every shadow. I would remain here, in this ward, haunted and hunted, knowing that the figure was always near, watching, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to pull me into its endless, dark embrace.